This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the tool to use to make a website for your brand and grow your business. Look, you've heard me talk about Squarespace before, lots of times, and honestly, if you're making a website anywhere else in 2022, well, that seems a little bit insane, because Squarespace have all the tools you could ever need in one place. And not only that, but that place is super easy to navigate and make a website from. All you got to do, go over to squarespace.com. From there, the next step for those that want to be quick is to browse through their extensive selection of beautiful templates, and they make this super easy for you. They'll ask you, like, what's your site about? And you'll say photography or whatever you do. They'll then ask you about your goals, and there's lots of options from collect donations to things like sell services. They then show you the best matching templates. You pick one that you love and you go from there, customizing it and making it just perfect for you. Plus, there's also loads of other features you can use. You can put a little email form on your site so people could contact you, stuff like that, which is bound to increase your business. Of course, or does all the basics like analytics and blogging. So go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood and you'll get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now today's video. When we talk about the sexuality of the Greeks and Romans, thanks to Hollywood, probably pops instantly to your mind are things like decadent orgies, as depicted in such classic films as the 1979 erotic historical drama Caligula, starring such Hollywood elite as Academy Award winner Dame Helen Mirren, 8-time Academy Award nominee Peter O'Toole, and Hollywood mainstay Malcolm McDowell, also noted British person. But was this actually how it was? Well, drop your togas and whip out your copy of Sappho's poetry, and let's discuss ancient Roman and Greek sex life, shall we? To begin with, it's important to understand how important class and status was in the sex practices of our ancient brethren. We'll do a deep dive into what this had to do with sex shortly, but to start, while the Greeks and Romans were very different cultures, they shared some similarities. One such similarity was the dominance of the upper classes. Those classes had a duty both to rule and defend Rome, or whatever Greek city-state they belonged to. It was the men who fought and the men who ruled. Men were voted in democratic elections in Greece, and men served in the Roman Senate. These men belonged to great families that cared very much about keeping their lineage pure and untarnished by the lower classes. Women were the target of this anxiety, and their sexuality, and particularly with regards to getting pregnant, was seen as a threat to the elite bloodlines. As such, women were forced to abide by a system that saw them as lesser than the men in their lives. This is a long way of saying men in both societies had much greater sexual freedoms than women, but that's not to say the men were wild by any standards. You see, Greeks and Romans were religious people that had rules and taboos in their religion to regulate sexual mores. Just like in Christianity, adultery was a great transgression. However, in Greek and Roman religion, adultery meant something different than what it means to us. For men, adultery was sleeping with another man's wife. Chastity for a Roman man did not mean the full abstainment from sex, but rather moderation when sleeping with socially approved partners such as your wife, prostitutes, slaves, servants, mistresses, concubines, and even young boys, and more on that later. However, even with the vast sexual freedom males enjoyed, in theory they were expected to show a level of moderation, as this was considered an elite virtue that proved you were worthy of your station and responsibilities in society. If you could control your desires and not give in to them as much, you can control the people under you and handle your difficult duties well. So, what about the women? Here we have a very different picture. Adultery for women was sleeping with any man not their husband. Women were heavily controlled. Both societies were gender segregated, but Greece much more so than Rome. While of course different city-states had differences, in the general case, Greek women were isolated from other men as much as possible. They were not even typically allowed to eat at a table if another man other than their husband was eating at it. The Greeks also had officials whose job it was to control and police women. This included everything from policing women's dress and conduct in public and private settings to also supervising female religious rituals and female behavior in ceremonies. On the other hand, Roman women had more of a public presence, lived less gender-segregated lives, and could socialize with men outside of their family and marriage. However, this didn't mean they were as liberated as the men. If an elite woman was too involved in society, her husband was often accused of weakness, and the weakness of one elite man threatened the delicate class order. As such, women were still controlled in Roman society, and even though the level of control was less than in Greek society, it still still had its own flavour of malice. If you know anything about Rome's mythological foundations, there is a lot of sexual assault involved. The first real presence of women in the foundation myth is the kidnapping and forced habitation of the Sabine women. Later, the Etruscan prince sexually assaults the noble Lucretia. With that unfortunate history comes honour killings. Elite Roman women like Lucretia set a standard that a woman's degradation was degradation of her family. As such, Lucretia committed suicide to protect her and her family's reputation, setting the standard that the violation of an elite woman should be met with death. Honour killings became a feature of Rome's understanding of women and class. Even an elite woman receiving an unwanted kiss from a lower-class man was enough to prompt that man's death. It is also important to keep in mind that even when Greece fell under the Roman Empire, they still maintained very different cultures. The Romans thought the Greeks were backwards and prudish, while the Greeks thought the Romans were too wild and free with their women. It is also important to remember that others existed in the Roman Empire and the Hellenic world. Etruscans, who used to be an early rival of the Romans, were seen to have much freer sexual relations, and we could, without a doubt, label them as wild, even by modern standards. Greeks were appalled that Etruscan women could eat freely in front of men and walk around naked. More to the topic at hand, men and women could have sex any place, in any act, any time, with anyone. That said, going back to the Greeks, as alluded to, there was a lot of variation. The Spartans, for example, led a very different society that normalized sexual relations between men and boys, and even for a time, women and girls. This brings us to the other big stereotype about the classical world, the Greek fondness for boys, or pedestry. That the Greeks practiced pedestry is not a myth. This was a practice among elite Greek men and boys to set up mentorships and prepare the next generation for their duties. The Hellenic ideal of moderation played a big role here. Sexual acts between these pairs were expected to happen, but a chaste, loving relationship was also encouraged. Thus, ideally, these relationships remained chaste if sexually charged. Mentors liked to leer at their charges while they trained in some duties naked, especially wrestling, a beloved pastime of elite Greek men. This brings us back to the alluded to huge difference between us today and the Hellenic world. They perceived sexual acts not so much defined by male and female, but passive and dominant. And key here was that elite men must always be dominant and never passive, and your station in life played a big part in what role you could play in the bedroom. For example, in their view, anal penetration was as passive as a man can get, and thus an elite male would never acceptably bottom. In fact, in Rome, a good character assassination of an elite man was to charge him with having been passive and receiving penetrative sex from his mentor as a youth. No less large of a historic figure as Julius Caesar was accused of this, and indeed such a huge stigma was attached to this that many a political career was ruined by such charges, and a great way to vilify someone in history as well was to discuss them partaking in such practices. This was a big reason why the practice of pedestry wasn't emulated in Rome as in Greece. A chaste relationship, instead, was supposed to be the ideal, as it built strong emotional connections between the boys and the men, but without the major stigma for the boy once he became a man. That said, although the Romans did not practice pedestry like the Greeks, it doesn't mean that Roman men didn't enjoy such relations. Again, the distinction here had more to do with your status and the dominant and passive paradigm. As such, slave boys were popular sexual partners for elite men, even receiving the nickname of pet with no stigma, as were prostitutes and men of certain vocations like actors. But again, the Romans did not like the Greek practice of pedestry and saw it as proof of the Greeks' backwardness, so they left it out of the training of elite boys. Despite the different cultural attitudes about pedestry, the two did share similarities when it came to passivity, looking down on males that were passive in both societies. As far as women and homosexuality in these cultures go, we know much less. While male homosexuality was usually accepted, again, within the bounds of class and passive and dominant, female homosexuality seems to have been much less so. That said, in different cultures, such as on Lesbos and Sparta, female homosexuality was accepted. Noteworthy here, there is the famous poet Sappho of Lesbos, who lived between 630 and 570 BC. It was her love of poetry and Lesbos' own reputation as being more open culturally to female homosexuality that gave us the term lesbian. In any event, despite this, for most Greeks and Romans, sexual relations between women were seen as unnatural and associated with prostitutes. We do not know why this association was made, but we do see a stereotype of women who have sex with women as being ugly prostitutes. Even Sappho was portrayed in later Roman and Greek literature as such. We also know that elite women were usually not afforded the option of homosexual relationships the way men were, although it definitely happened. In these cases, it was not considered adultery, but it was overall frowned upon. Now this brings us to prostitution, which we've brought up quite a bit for good reason. Indeed, if public acceptance of prostitution is your mileage for how wild a society is, then the Greeks and Romans were extremely wild. There was no shame or stigma in purchasing the services of a prostitute, and the trade was even regulated by the state. It should also be noted that there were many levels to prostitution. High-level prostitutes openly socialized with upper classes and even attended dinner parties. They could also be educated and accrue power, even in the gender-segregated world of the ancient Greeks. This is seen in the writings of Athenaeus. Lower-level prostitutes varied depending on how much they charged and where they had sex with their clients. A common word for lower prostitutes in Latin was lupa or wolf, with a brothel sometimes called a wolf's den. All that said, while a prostitute's status may be high or low and hiring one's services was commonly and perfectly acceptable, the Romans and Greeks generally looked down on prostitutes themselves to some extent. Such hostility can be seen when Juvenal accused Empress Messalina of being a prostitute, a charge that would have come up against future empresses such as Empress Theodora. You might at this point be wondering about the sex acts themselves and whether they could be characterized as particularly wild by our standards. And in short, please. We have the internet and Rule 34, so no, we absolutely dominate there. And the ancient Romans were definitely our collective passives. In fact, sex between a man and any of his approved partners was limited in the kind of acts, at least in terms of what was considered socially acceptable. An elite man was expected to remain dominant, thus acts we consider perfectly normal in our beds could be perceived as passive and inappropriate for an elite man to undergo. The obvious here is anal penetration. It was completely out of the question for an elite to receive. However, what might surprise you is that oral sex, whether fellatio or cunnilingus, was forbidden. In Roman purity ritual law, sexual discharge was considered impure, so rituals of ablution and purification were undergone, especially after sex, to prepare for religious rituals. Oral sex was seen as especially problematic, as the impurity of the discharge could be passed to anyone you kiss. This leaves the options for sexual intercourse rather limited by our standards today. That said, we do know they had sex toys, as depicted in art and pottery, and birth control was widely practiced, of which they apparently used many methods that were quite effective, most of which have been lost to history. Of course, most of these sexual mores and practices changed with the advent of Christianity, with much of this having to do with the attitude of Paul of Tarsus. Paul redefined chastity for these societies. Sex in general was discouraged, but in the words of Paul in his letter to Corinthians, it is better to marry than to burn. In the same letter, Paul made the groundbreaking change to limit the sexual partners of men to just their wives. In his letter to the Romans, Paul further prunes what is acceptable sexually, particularly considering any homosexual act as dishonorable and unnatural, and linked it with other grave sins. It should be noted here that somewhat ironically, and perhaps influencing the doctrine against the idea, many pagans saw the early Christians as a wild sex cult. In fact, this secretive gender-mixed rituals were seen as a front for sex rituals, a charge some early Christian martyrs attempted to disprove by castrating themselves. Of course, Paul won at the end of the day, and many of the Greek and Roman sexual practices taken for granted over the millennia rapidly disappeared thanks to this shift in thinking. In the end, while it's likely true that some ancient Romans and Greeks did basically everything it's possible to do to one another sexually behind closed doors, when looking at what the cultures themselves considered acceptable, the Greeks and Romans were both more prudish than our collective modern selves in some ways, and at the same time wilder in terms of certain things that were accepted, some of which in modern times might see them thrown in prison for a good long time. Perhaps the most interesting distinction of all is that sexual norms in the Hellenic world were shaped more by class anxieties and your station in life rather than factors like religion or even, to an extent, gender or age. To the Greeks and Romans, another world where these mores are not shaped by class anxieties would seem unnatural and even bizarre, perhaps every bit as bizarre as we find some of their practices.